All right. Now we will be taking a look at the API management capabilities of the Frends platform and look at a real life composite API use case where we basically combine multiple services and data into a single harmonious endpoint to make the consummation of that business function much easier via the orchestration capabilities of Frends. So to start things off here, we can navigate to the API management section found under the APIs drop-down here on the Frends platform. And immediately we're greeted with a view where we can see all of our APIs, where they are where they are deployed, and of course can see various information about those APIs, such as the version number of the API, technical versioning of the different endpoints, and of course different API endpoint configurations. The way that we do any sort of API development on the Frends platform is using what we're calling specification first approach, meaning that we basically first define the API specification, in essence, what the API should look like. And this is something that we now use to configure the actual API endpoints to perform the functionality we would like them to do. We have two different options for the configuration. We can create pass-through API configurations where we are simply routing an API request from the Frends agent to another system on the backend, or we can create an actual Frends process to act as the backend for that particular API. Of course, when it comes to API management, we do offer full API monitoring capabilities to see absolutely all incoming API requests, what's going on with those requests, with the option, of course, actually to jump into the more detailed monitoring of the Frends integration process underlining the API. And finally, we do support fully unified API policy management, where we can actually define which API endpoints are governed by which API policy. We can, of course, apply throttling and rate limiting capabilities into our APIs. And finally, of course, select what sort of identities do we allow to have access into our APIs themselves. We support three different authentication mechanisms: OAuth, private application registrations, which are basically static OAuth tokens, or the more traditional API key. If we go ahead and have a brief look at the order process API we have created here, we can actually look at the orders API, which is now the composite API I was talking about earlier. We can actually see a direct link here to a Frends backend process, which is actually deployed into our development environment with the version 0.1.22. And we can directly jump into the configuration of that API and actually see how that composite API has been built. The ideology behind this particular composite API is that we actually need to perform an order transaction into our SAP system. And the way that we do that is, of course, now the trigger is actually inherited directly from our API management. So you can actually see most of the functionality and configuration is locked, including authorizations, authentication, the open API specification policies, all of that, since that's something that we are now managing on the API management side of things. But this defines, the trigger defines the end starting point for the API call, and of course provides us with the incoming message. So first up, what we do is we do quite a bit of validation for the order. So we just validate the order message itself before actually checking that the order that the customer or the customer in the order we are actually processing is that customer found in our CRM system using our Frends standard connectors. We are also checking, are the order items that the order is targeting in our inventory or not? And of course, in both cases, we return dedicated specific error codes handling both of those scenarios. But the interesting part and the composite part becomes here in the purchase order creation transaction, where we actually implement a single transaction scope, because our ERP system, SAP in this case, actually requires us to first reserve the order items in our SAP, then use a dedicated pricing service to calculate the actual real-time price for that particular order, and only then we finalize the transaction in our SAP. And because we are now running this in a transaction scope, we have actually implemented error handling here as well, saying that if any part of the transaction fails, we need to fail gracefully. And what that means is that we are actually clearing the reservation if we had time to make it in our SAP system, basically releasing the items for further circulation in case anything goes wrong in our order creation transaction. One cool thing to note here is that after the transaction is either done successfully or if we fail, we actually just simply create the response message for the order, depending on if it's a success or a failure of the API execution. And we use what we are calling the intermediate return shape here in Frends, meaning that this is the part where we actually return the message to the API consumer, but we actually continue the execution afterwards in an asynchronous mode, because if the order creation is successful, we want to actually generate an order summary using our intelligent AI connector and send an internal email notification to our sales team about the successful order going in. And now, of course, if we wanted to actually consume this API, what we do is we, of course, use the same agent-based approach where we have different environments and the whole pipeline from development to through test to production. And all of those agents always expose the actual API itself, which we can access through the API specification UI. And this is, of course, something that the users could use to directly test out the APIs and access the API on the agent itself. And this architecture also allows us to now distribute different API gateways or API hosts to wherever they might be required in the customer's infrastructure, including on-premise deployments. But this is maybe the first step along the way, because of course, now if I really wanted to make this API discoverable to either external parties or for my internal constituents within my organization, I would like to use the Frends API portal, which is a paid add-on that you can configure on top of the existing Frends UI. And what the Frends API portal allows you to do is actually build and manage API products consisting of multiple API endpoints hosted on the actual Frends platform. And of course, because the API portal is discoverable, you can provide all kinds of documentation about your APIs. You can search your API products. You can, of course, look at the documentation of an individual API product. And of course, the main functionality is then to view what a single API actually looks like. So here we can see our order API exposed as an API product in our API portal. And the main functionality is, of course, self-service capability through the API portal, meaning that as a registered user or a logged-in user, I can actually request access to get started in a sandbox environment fully automatically. So I can actually grab my access token straight away, or for production access, I would have to request access to from my administrative team managing the API portal to start using the API in a production setting. The API portal, of course, also contains multiple administration capabilities, such as, for example, managing incoming API requests for production access or invitations for developers and organizations to join the API portal. We can, of course, manage different types of organizations and users logged into our API portal. And as a final cherry on top, the API portal is actually fully white labelable and configurable with your colors, fonts, logos, texts, pictures to make it appear according to your brand guidelines.